Franklin Delano Roosevelt was the 32nd president of the United States. He's the only president who was voted in more than the 2 times that presidents are allowed to be in. He was voted in 4 times, probably because it was war years. But he said something that I need to hear and perhaps you need to hear. And it sounds trite, but perhaps it's very important for you. And he said, when you come to the end of your rope, tie a knot and hang on. Somebody else said, anyone can give up. It's the easiest thing in the world to do. But the person who holds it together, when everyone around him would understand if everything fell apart, that's true strength. And when you got diagnosed, or someone close to you got diagnosed with bladder cancer, sometimes we feel like we're going to fall apart. Sometimes we feel like we're at the end of our rope. And if you're at that point right now, tie a knot. Hang on. You know, some doctors, perhaps the ones here, but some doctors who aren't here may not understand what it's like when the doctor looks at you right in the eye and says, you've got bladder cancer. Perhaps they give that news to someone almost every day. And perhaps for some, it becomes almost commonplace. It's never commonplace for the patient who gets the news. Your world tilts a little bit on its axis when you hear that you've got cancer. Oh, it's only bladder cancer. Most people that get bladder cancer are well treated and live long lives, and that's a great encouragement. But you don't hear any of that after you hear the word that you've got cancer. I understand a little bit about that because 4 years ago, I went to my doctor and said, I've got hematuria. I'm not worried about it. And he looked me right in the eye and he said, I am. And all the tests, and to the urologist, and the cystoscopy, and wasn't that first cystoscopy a riveting experience? I don't think it's quite so riveting for the urologist who gives it, or for the nurse who stands at your shoulder and pats you on the shoulder and says, take a deep breath. Take a deep breath. That's just going to expand the scream that comes out of my mouth. And over the next 2.5 years, after the diagnosis of transitional cell carcinoma, urothelial carcinoma, bladder cancer, I would have 11 cystoscopies. I would have 6 transurethral resections of the bladder tumors. And I would have 34 treatments of BCG, mitomycin C, and gemcitabine. And 2.5 years in, I went for another soul-riveting experience of a cystoscopy and was told, following the resection and the pathology report that came back, that I now had muscle-invasive bladder cancer. Probably 20 to 30% of people who initially present with superficial bladder cancer will progress to muscle-invasive disease. I was one of the lucky ones. But it took nearly 5 months from that diagnosis to when I actually got the radical cystectomy. And there's a bunch of reasons for that, and they don't matter tonight. But I didn't have time for the neoadjuvant chemotherapy. And I had to promise on my youngest child that I would take adjuvant chemotherapy. And 2 weeks after I discussed all of that with a radiation oncologist, a medical oncologist, and the surgeon, I got the call to say, it's time to come in and have your surgery. December 15th, 2010. So I know something of what some of you may be experiencing tonight, depending on where you are on that rope. Tie a knot and hang on. It's not unusual, let me put it this way, it's not unusual for me to have medical issues. At 16, I got insulin-dependent diabetes, type 1 diabetes. I wear an insulin pump, and that keeps me in good shape. At 45, I had a heart attack. The blockage was stented, but it restenosed, it blocked again. And 8 months later, I had coronary artery bypass surgery. So I'm a member of the Zipper Club. Anyone else in the Zipper Club? Anyway, you don't have to admit it. At 52 years of age, 4 years ago, I got bladder cancer. And just when you think that's all you're going to get, 6 months ago, I was diagnosed with celiac disease. I was relieved when I got celiac disease. Because there's no surgery, there's no medications, there's no needles, just don't eat things with gluten in it. So food that doesn't have gluten in it tastes like rubbish, but I'm still trying to figure out what I can learn from having celiac disease. But some of the things I'm learning in life have to do with developing a little bit of courage. We used to call cancer the big C. You know what? If you get the big C, you need to get a bigger C, and that's courage. John Wayne said, courage is when you're scared to death and you saddle up anyway. Nelson Mandela perhaps put it a little more eloquently when he said, I have learned that courage is not the absence of fear, but the triumph over it. The brave man is not he who is not afraid, but he who conquers that fear. When you get bladder cancer, if you're anything like me, you're a bit afraid. And you're not sure what the future holds. And there may be anger, and there may be sadness, and there may be confusion, and there may be that feeling of, I'm all alone. How can the world go on like it is, and everything in my life has changed with that diagnosis? And you develop courage, not an absence of fear, but a learning how to cope with it in some of the ways that we were hearing about earlier. Tim Bowden, in his book, One Crowded Hour, talks a little bit about an Australian photographer called Neil Davis, who was in Borneo in 1964 when Indonesia and Malaysia had a confrontation. And the Gurkhas, those fearsome warriors from Nepal, were asked one day if they would jump out of a transport plane into combat if the need arose. And they had the right to refuse because they weren't trained paratroopers. But the Gurkhas rarely refused to do anything they were asked to do. But on this particular occasion, so says Neil Davis, on this particular occasion, when they were asked by the British officer whether they would be prepared to jump into Indonesia, they had the right to decline, and they provisionally declined. And they went away that night and discussed it among themselves, and one of their non-commissioned officers came to the British officer who had asked them the next day and said, "We've discussed this, and we're prepared to do it, but we have a couple of provisos, a couple of conditions." Well, the British officer said, "What are those?" "Well, we're prepared to jump out of the plane if we'll land on marshy ground or soft ground with no rocky outcroppings, because we're not trained to jump out of planes." Well, the British officer said, "We'll primarily be jumping over jungle. So that shouldn't be a problem, no rocky outcroppings, and the ground won't be particularly hard. What's your other condition?" "Oh," said the Gurkha, "we want the airplane to fly as slowly as possible and no higher than 100 feet off the ground." And the British officer said, "Well, we always fly airplanes as slowly as possible and yet keep them in the air when we're dropping troops. But 100 feet off the ground, that's not high enough. Your parachute would never have a chance to open." "Oh," said the Gurkha, "that changes everything. You didn't mention anything about parachutes before." Courage. These guys were prepared to jump out of a slow-moving airplane at 100 feet above the ground with no parachute, for the sake of the mission, for the sake of accomplishing the goal. Talk about determination. Talk about resolve. Talk about commitment. Talk about courage. I ask you tonight, how's your courage? You're facing bladder cancer. You're facing a lifetime, perhaps, of cystoscopies. You're facing, perhaps, transurethral resections, more than one. You're facing, perhaps, BCG treatments, which have their own side effects, and mitomycin C, and a variety of other potential treatments. Because bladder cancer is not the kind of disease where you get diagnosed, you get surgery, you get chemotherapy, and, hey, I'm cured, I don't need to see the doctor anymore. This is lifetime. And if you're ever tempted to miss your urologist's appointment for your cystoscopy, give yourself a shake. This cancer recurs up to 80% of the time. And you may not know it. And you may not feel it. And you may not have the symptoms. Make sure you're not missing any of those appointments. It could save your life. At the least, it might save your bladder. Maya Angelou, who was an American poet and author, said, "If you don't like something, change it. And if you can't change it, change your attitude. Don't complain." We can't change, however many of us are in the audience that have bladder cancer. We can't change that. It sucks. But we can change our attitude. We can tie a knot and hang on. We can saddle up in spite of the fear. And we need to have that attitude that life is good, because life is good. Life is great. I live with a neobladder every day, and while I'd prefer to have the original manufacturer's equipment, nonetheless, this is a pretty good replacement. And I live a new normal, but it's a real good life. And I'm learning 4 things, which I'll do quickly. I'm learning about trust. And I don't know about you, but I trust in God. I trust in my doctors. I put my life in their hands. But I trust in God too. I have faith. and that sustains me. And that has grown stronger, not weaker, through this whole time. Secondly, I've got a bit more clarity on what I call my 4 Ps. Think about it. 4 Ps, bladder cancer, urine. Okay, you'll get it later tonight. But the 4 Ps are purpose, priorities, passion, and potential. I've gotten a little more clarity in the last 4 years about what my purpose is here on earth. I've got a little more clarity about what my priorities are. Someone said you don't get second things by putting them first. You get second things by putting first things first. Are you putting the first things first in your life? And I'm learning what some of those things are, and more importantly, who some of those people are in my life. I don't get the second things by putting them first. I get the second things by putting the first things, the first people, first. I've learned a little more about what my passion is, and this is part of it. Helping people. Because I've gone through some things that maybe some of you are going through. And I had somebody that I could pick up the phone and call, and a website that I could go on and ask questions. And people were giving me information and encouragement and humor. There's more humor on this site. You know, just because you've got cancer doesn't mean you can't laugh. There's some pretty funny things that happen when my diaper leaks at night. And I wear a diaper to bed. Talk about humiliation the first time you put that on at 55 years of age. But my kids don't let me get down. And if the diaper leaks, my wife's a lifeguard. So I'm covered both ways. You got to laugh. Take it seriously, but laugh about the things you can laugh about. Because there's some funny stuff. The third thing is I've learned that I'm an example. Not to you necessarily, but I'm an example to my wife. I'm an example to my kids. I'm an example to my colleagues. I'm an example to my friends of somebody who's going through a crisis, a health crisis in this case. And when my sons look at me, they're in their 20s, when my sons look at me, Dad's got bladder cancer. How's he handling it? To some extent, they see an example of when crisis hits in their life, because if you're not in a crisis now, just hang around for a bit, there's one coming. How does my dad handle crisis in his life? Does he fall apart? Or does he hold it together? Does he have a little bit of courage? And we're an example, whether we want to be or not. We're a good one, or we're not so good. But that can change going forward as we get clarity because of our bladder cancer. And the fourth thing is live a joyful life. That doesn't mean to say you have to be happy every day. There's a difference between happiness and joy. Happiness tends to depend on circumstances. It's a beautiful day, I'm happy. I got a raise at work, I'm happy. My wife loves me, I'm happy. Joy's deeper. Joy comes from within, and it's an attitude, and to some extent at least, it's a choice. And I choose to get up every day and be joyful. Just in closing, Richard Bach wrote the novel Jonathan Livingston Seagull in 1970. Perhaps some of you have read it. He said, here is a test to see whether your life or your mission on earth is finished. If you're alive, it isn't. Are you alive? Your mission's not over. You may be at the end of your rope, but hang on to that knot. You may be getting on a horse that's bucking. Saddle up anyway. And you may not know there's a parachute, but you're willing to jump in any case. And you can go out of here with the experience that you have and that you get with bladder cancer and help somebody else. And as somebody has said, they may not remember your name, but they'll remember how you made them feel. Go out and make somebody feel that they can hang on, that they can get through this, that they can live a joyful life, that they can make a difference in somebody else's life. I wish you all the best.